The town of Umuachi had always been quiet, forgotten by the world. But everything changed when Pastor Chikwudi arrived. No one knew exactly where he came from. He simply appeared one day, setting up a small church in an abandoned building near the town square. At first, the people were skeptical. Umuachi had seen its share of self-proclaimed men of God, but something about Pastor Chikwudi was different. He spoke with authority, his sermons full of fire and passion. Then, the miracles began. Mama Ifeoma, blind for 10 years, saw again after his prayers. Baba Ibuka, a crippled war veteran, stood up and walked. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, the small church overflowed with people seeking healing, prosperity, and hope. Pastor Chikwudi never asked for money. All he required was faith and devotion. But hidden behind his charismatic smile and piercing eyes was a dark secret. Every miracle came with a price. A price no one realized they were paying. A month after Pastor Chikwudi's arrival, strange things started happening. Mama Ifeoma, who had regained her sight, was found staring blankly at the walls of her home, whispering in an unknown language. Baba Ibuka disappeared one night, only for his wife to find him kneeling in the bush behind their house, muttering prayers with lifeless eyes. Other townspeople who had received the pastor's blessings began complaining of vivid nightmares, dark figures watching them from the corners of their rooms. Adanna Nwosu, a young journalist who had recently returned to Umuachi to take care of her sick brother, grew suspicious. Her brother, Chijioke, had been among the first to be healed by Pastor Chikwudi. Once bound to a wheelchair, he now walked freely, but Adanna noticed something was off. He was distant, his once bright personality now eerily subdued. He barely spoke and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, unable to remember his dreams. Determined to uncover the truth, Adanna started attending Pastor Chikwudi's sermons, watching him carefully. The way his eyes would linger on certain people, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, it all felt wrong. And then there was the night she saw him in the village cemetery, speaking to something unseen, his hands raised in a silent pact. Adanna dug deeper, talking to the families of those who had received the pastor's blessings. One thing became clear, none of them were the same. Some had lost their minds, others had become eerily successful overnight but seemed detached from reality, as if they were only shells of their former selves. She visited an old priest, Father Maduka, who had lived in Umuachi for decades. His face turned pale at the mention of Pastor Chikwudi. "You need to leave this alone, my daughter," he whispered. "Chikwudi isn't a man of God. He's a collector." "A collector of what?" Adanna pressed. Father Maduka hesitated before replying. "Souls." Adanna's blood ran cold. She hurried home that night, only to find Chijioke standing in the middle of his room, eyes rolled back, whispering in a voice that was not his own. When she called his name, he turned to her, his face twisted into a sinister grin. "You shouldn't have interfered, Adanna," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Terrified, she realized the horrifying truth. Chijioke's destiny no longer belonged to him. It belonged to something far worse. And Pastor Chikwudi was only getting started. Adanna barely slept that night. Chijioke returned to normal the next morning, or at least he seemed to. He had no memory of what had happened, but his eyes held a distant, haunted look. She knew she had to act fast. She decided to go back to Father Maduka, but when she reached his house, she found his door ajar. The room was in disarray, and the priest was nowhere to be found. On his table, an old book lay open, its pages filled with strange symbols and warnings about the Pact of the Devourer. Reading through the text, Adanna learned that certain individuals could strike a deal with an ancient force, one that granted them power in exchange for the destinies of others. The contract was sealed with a ritual, binding the victims to the entity without their knowledge. The only way to break the pact was to destroy the one who had made it, Pastor Chikwudi. As she absorbed the terrifying truth, she heard footsteps outside. She barely had time to hide before two men in black suits entered. their movements precise and unnatural. They searched the room, looking for something, or someone. Adanna held her breath as they moved past her, their eyes unervingly blank. Then, as suddenly as they came, they left. Shaken, Adanna knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But who could she trust when Pastor Chukwudi had the entire town under his spell? Adanna sought out her childhood friend, Ifani, who had always been skeptical of the pastor's miracles. When she told him what she had learned, he didn't doubt her. "I knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into this town," Ifani said. "But how do we stop him?" "There's a way," Adanna whispered. "But it's dangerous." That night, they sneaked into the church, searching for evidence. They found a hidden door behind the pulpit, leading to a dark basement. There, they saw what could only be described as an altar, an ancient stone slab covered in dried blood, surrounded by candles and strange carvings. A chill ran down Adanna's spine as she realized the truth. This was where Pastor Chukwudi sealed his unholy pacts. Then, a voice echoed from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." They turned to see Pastor Chukwudi standing at the entrance, his eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. The church doors slammed shut on their own, trapping them inside. "Since you want to know the truth so badly," he said, stepping forward with a menacing smile, "let me show you what real power looks like." A deafening roar filled the room, and the candles flickered wildly as shadows stretched and twisted into monstrous shapes. Ifani grabbed Adanna's hand. "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. As the shadows lunged, Adanna grabbed the nearest candle and flung it at the dark figures. The flame passed through them, but they recoiled, screeching. Ifani yanked a rusted iron rod from the altar and swung at the nearest figure, causing it to dissipate with an eerie wail. Pastor Chukwudi watched them with amusement. "You think you can fight me? My power is beyond your comprehension." Adanna's mind raced. The book in Father Maduka's house had mentioned that the pact was sealed with a ritual. If they could find the source of his power and break it, they might have a chance. She locked eyes with Ifani. "We need to destroy the altar." With renewed determination, they fought their way towards it, unaware that something far worse was about to be unleashed. Adanna and Ifani braced themselves as the darkness swirled around them. The air grew thick, suffocating, as Pastor Chukwudi raised his hands, his voice merging with the whispers of unseen forces. The monstrous shadows crept closer, their glowing eyes fixed on Adanna and Ifani. "You cannot stop this," Pastor Chukwudi said, his voice layered with something ancient. "The pact has been sealed. The destinies have been claimed. And now, you will join them." But Adanna wasn't ready to give up. She remembered what she had read in Father Maduka's book. Rituals of dark power were often bound to a physical object, something that tethered the pact to the mortal world. Her eyes darted around the basement until they landed on a large, ornate bowl resting on the altar, filled with a thick, inky liquid that seemed to swirl with stolen souls. "The bowl!" she shouted to Ifani. "We have to destroy it." Ifani didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the altar, dodging the grasping shadows, and grabbed the bowl. The liquid inside pulsed violently as if sensing the attack. Just as he lifted it, Pastor Chukwudi let out a roar of rage. A powerful force flung Ifani backward, slamming him into the stone wall. He groaned, dazed but still conscious. Adanna ran to him, but the shadows blocked her path. One of them wrapped around her ankle, cold and suffocating, pulling her towards the altar. Pastor Chukwudi's laughter echoed through the chamber as the shadows began to engulf her. Summoning every ounce of strength, Adanna reached for the iron rod Ifani had dropped. With a desperate swing, she smashed it into the bowl. The moment the rod made contact, a deafening scream erupted from within the liquid. The bowl cracked, and a wave of darkness burst forth, throwing everyone off their feet. The shadows screeched in agony, writhing and dissipating into nothingness. Pastor Chukwudi clutched his chest, his face twisted in shock. Cracks formed along his skin, glowing with an eerie red light. "No, this is impossible," he gasped. With one final inhuman scream, his body shattered into a cloud of ashes. The moment Pastor Chikwudi was destroyed, the church walls trembled. The very foundation groaned as if rejecting what had just happened. Adanna and Ifani scrambled to their feet and rushed towards the exit as the building started collapsing around them. They barely made it outside before the entire structure caved in, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. The church, once filled with devoted worshippers, was now nothing more than ruins. The town of Umuachi awoke to the sound of the collapse. People rushed out of their homes, confused and terrified. Those who had been under Pastor Chikwidi's influence blinked as if waking from a long dream. Mama Ifioma fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she realized she had been free from whatever dark force had controlled her. Others murmured in confusion, feeling the weight that had been pressing on their souls suddenly lift. Adanna searched the crowd for Chijioke. When she finally found him, he was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. "Adanna, I think I was lost," he whispered. She hugged him tightly. "You're back now. That's all that matters." But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Breaking the pact had freed the town, but it had also exposed them to the reality of what lurked in the shadows. Pastor Chikwudi had been just one servant of the darkness. Who knew how many more were out there? Days passed, and Umuachi slowly returned to normal. People tried to rebuild their lives, but the scars of Pastor Chikwidi's reign remained. Some had lost loved ones, others had lost time, and a few had lost themselves entirely. Adanna couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The nightmares hadn't stopped. Every night, she saw glimpses of a figure watching her from the shadows, waiting. Then, one evening, a stranger arrived in town. He was young, charismatic, and full of divine energy. His white suit was spotless, and his voice carried the same conviction that had once drawn people to Pastor Chikwudi. He called himself Prophet Emmanuel. As he set up a new church in the ruins of the old one, he addressed the people with a warm, reassuring smile. "Come and receive your blessings. Faith is all you need." Adanna stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her heart sinking. The cycle had begun again.